So history can tell you a lot about how to be a good Prime Minister and how to be a bad Prime Minister. Now, a lot of you commented on my last video about history and the polls, saying essentially that I got a lot of the facts wrong and I got a lot of the information wrong. I assure you this video is going to be much more scripted, much more edited and much more factually correct. What I've done this time with my bubbles and my crazy lines is I've gone through each Prime Minister and noted down some key policies that history remembers them by. So if you didn't catch my last video, just to let you guys know, the size of this bubble represents the amount of seats that each of these Prime Ministers gains during their first election. I didn't include every term in this, but just their first election. This graph here represents gross GDP, I believe, of the UK from 1945 all the way to 2012. And then this line here is their timeline. So the longer the timeline, the longer they have been Prime Minister or that party has been Prime Minister. And each little notch is like a little moment in history, a policy or something that happens during the course of their term. So we start off with Clement Attlee. He took office after World War II. He oversaw the nationalisation of the Bank of England. He founded the NHS. There was austerity after the war. But look, he helped the UK join the Korean War. Doing that after World War II isn't going to go down too well. So no surprise, the country and the party in charge switches. Winston Churchill takes office. There's still rationing going on after the war, and the Queen gets coronated. Then we have Anthony Eden. He introduces premium bonds. He nationalises the Suez Canal in Egypt. And then we go on to Harold Macmillan. They have the Notting Hill riots, the first Cold War, and then it changes to Alec Douglas. He oversees Nyasaland, which is in Africa, their independence from the British Empire. And then Harold Wilson takes over. He oversaw the North Rhodesian independence, the devaluation of the pound, so that was the first instance of Labour being economically unsuccessful. There's a much more obvious incident later on in this timeline, and he decriminalised homosexuality. But the troubles begin. That's again another war starting towards the end of his term, so no surprise, the party in charge switches. Edward Heath oversaw economic U-turn towards the start of his term. He introduced the Misuse of Drugs Act. He saw the Second Cold War, which is fine because it's in the middle of his term, so it's not going to affect too much here. It was the National Union of Miners strike, which saw his term end. He also resigned due to ill health, and his party change once again. So when Harold Wilson becomes PM again, he managed to end the strikes, which is good. He introduces the Health and Safety at Work Act, but the Third Cold War starts. After that, we get the International Monetary Fund crisis, and he loses, I can't remember what war that was, but he loses a war. And then James Callaghan takes over, and we get the Winter of Discontent happening towards the end of his term again. No surprise, the party switches. So Margaret Thatcher takes over. She introduces the right to buy council houses. She starts the Falklands War towards the end of her first term, but it doesn't seem to affect her majority in the next election, which is the only instance I've had here of somebody starting a war towards the end of their term and actually gaining from it rather than losing out from it in the next election. Then we have civil unrest in the miners' strike, but that's okay because that's towards the middle of her term, so it doesn't really affect any election. Then we have the deregulation of the financial markets. Obviously the economy is doing well here. She wins her third term. She introduces poll tax, provoking civil unrest, and then the Gulf War commences. So you've got this civil unrest and another war, and we change Prime Minister again. This time, 1990, the dot-com bubble has burst, so we've got a small recession here. We have a Gulf War victory. Everything's doing well. We have the end of the Cold War. Great. Council tax is introduced, and the rail is privatised. Why did it switch here? Mainly because we've had all this time with the Conservative Party. That's a huge amount of time compared to what it used to be, when it used to be just red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. We've had, what, 20 years here of the Conservative Party? So it's no surprise that we decide to switch. We decide to introduce a new party, a new vision for Britain. So, Tony Blair becomes PM. He assists in the Hong Kong handover to China. He creates independence for the Bank of England. He introduces the minimum wage. He introduces a London mayor, and he gets the Belfast Agreement. So he does a lot in his first term, and he's very, very successful in the Belfast Agreement towards the end of his term. So that's another war success towards the end of your term. So if you start a war towards the end of the term, chances are you're going to lose that next election. If you end a war towards the end of your term, chances are you're going to win the election. So he starts a war towards the start of his second term, UK intervention in Sierra Leone. That didn't really get remembered in history as anything particularly disadvantageous for Labour. But it was the invasion of Iraq that gets remembered in history as the disaster for Labour, as it was seen as illegal. He introduces civil partnerships. We have the London bombings. Identity Cards Act's introduced. And then he resigns, and then Gordon Brown becomes the Prime Minister. Now, Gordon Brown was very unsuccessful. You can see how red it is here on the graph. He misplaces child benefit data, which is a sign of economic failure. Then we have the financial crisis, and then we have the nationalisation of Northern Rock. No surprise, an unsuccessful Prime Minister loses the next election, and we have a changing party altogether. So what do the Conservatives do? Well, we're still coming out of this recession, so they introduce budget cuts, which in turn creates student protests. Those student protests weren't really justified anyway, but many people blame the ongoing austerity and the disillusionment of people with politics at this point. And then we had the intervention in Libya. Then we had the Welfare Reform Act. And then we decided to leave Iraq and Afghanistan, and we had Indy Ref 1. So 2 successes, 1 war success. Well, I say success here. Intervention wasn't exactly successful, but it ended at least. 1 Home Affairs success towards the end of his term, and no surprise, he wins the next term. But it's this term that really kind of every significant moment in history is all about Europe. So we have the migrant crisis, and then we have the EU referendum. He loses that, he resigns, and then Theresa May becomes PM. She makes the Brexit department, and she invokes Article 50. So you can see that any form of loss towards the end of a term is going to be interpreted as a change in government during the next election. Whereas a win towards the end of the term is going to almost certainly keep you in power, or keep your party in power, even if it's not particularly you. Also, to be a good Prime Minister, I'd advise starting a war towards the start of your term, because a war can be a bit of a gamble as to whether it's going to be successful or a failure. Also, try and get in as many reforms, particularly Home Affairs reforms, towards the start of your term as well. That way, any kind of civil unrest can happen towards the middle of your term, and it can be well out of the way before the election. So we're in Excel now. What I've done here is I've written down every Prime Minister's amount of days they've had in office, and the amount of terms they had in office, various policies that they carried out, and events that happened during their term time, and categorised them by various categories. So we got war starts, war success, war failure, economic reform, economic failure, foreign aid success, immigration increases, home affairs success, home affairs failures, referendum wins, referendum losses, constitutional reform, NHS success, austerity, EU agreements, riots, and social reform. And I've categorised them so that you can compare however many of these get you more days in office on average. So if a Prime Minister starts a war, they're more likely to get more days in office than if they fail at a war. But obviously, war success is going to get you the most days in office out of those three. If you introduce economic reform, it's going to get you more days in office on average than if you have economic failure. If you have foreign aid success, it's going to, on average, get you 2,000 days in office. But immigration increases will get you more days in office. That's interesting, probably because the data is kind of skewed by people who get more days in office when immigration increases, but it doesn't necessarily mean that immigration increase is seen as a good thing in the country. This is another interesting one. I found that Home Affair failure gets you the most days in office, whereas Home Affair success gets you the least. It's probably because we had people like Margaret Thatcher who oversaw the miners' strike. Now, the miners' strike was a huge thing in the country, but it happened in the middle of her term, and it only affected communities in the UK that weren't under the Conservative banner. It's a bit like the Southern Rail strikes we have in the UK at the moment. It's only going to affect the people that live in London and who catch that Southern Rail area. So it only affects the people, a very small minority of the UK, even though it's like national news. It's only a small minority of the UK. Obviously, a referendum win, it's going to win you more days than a referendum loss. NHS success is going to win you days, whereas austerity is going to lose you days. It's one of the lowest here. EU agreement is going to win you, it's quite significantly going to win you a lot of days on here, 3,000 days. Whereas riots, again, riots and any kind of Home Affair failure, strikes, etc. are seen as a fault by the people involved rather than a fault of the Prime Minister. So riots ultimately skew the data on this. And social reform. Social reform is just as going to win you about as many days as being Prime Minister during austerity. So the most important thing you can do as a Prime Minister is succeed in war, introduce economic reform, succeed in the NHS, and have some kind of foreign aid success, EU agreement, etc. The worst things you can do is to fail at war, fail on the economy, lose a referendum, and be Prime Minister during times of austerity. I'll ignore these two because they are skewing the data in terms of what people perceive as historic events that are the result of reaction rather than the result of the Prime Ministers themselves. This is a similar sort of graph, but it shows the terms in office. The data is more or less similar, so you're more likely to win more terms if you have succeeded in a war than if you fail in a war. You're more likely to win more terms if you introduce economic reform than if you have economic failure. You're more likely to win 2 terms on average if you have foreign aid success. But look at this. If you increase immigration, it's going to make you lose terms. So that's probably where the data is reactive to what we'd expect. Home Affair success is going to help you increase your terms. But Home Affair failure, again, skewing the data, not really mattering in this graph. Referendum winning is going to win you, on average, 2 terms. But if you lose a referendum, you've almost certainly lost your term. Constitutional reform. Well, it depends on how good that constitutional reform is. And that's probably why it's coming out as 1.5 terms. NHS success is not really important in this data, whereas everything else on average is likely to win you 2 terms. But as I say, this isn't showing voter intention or what people like or dislike. It's just showing the average way Prime Ministers since 1945 have stayed in office, depending on what's happened, what history is perceived as significant during their term time. So for example, there's a lot of education reform and environmental reform that probably happened during that time, but it's not seen as historically significant. And there's probably a lot I can interpret and pull out from history, depending on what party you support and who you're behind and who you felt was a good Prime Minister and who you thought was a terrible Prime Minister. But it shows the way in which history has certainly perceived them. So to be a good Prime Minister, you have to be Prime Minister during times of economic success. If your times during economic failure, you won't be remembered as a good Prime Minister. Number 2, don't be Prime Minister for too long. Tony Blair was Prime Minister for too long, and it happened to be that during his time he decided to invade Iraq, and history proved that that was a bad idea. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister for too long, and many people saw a lot of this as a disaster for the country. The other thing is, don't introduce a war towards the end of your term. Try and have a success. So for Theresa May, the likely thing to come up is going to be the EU deal. Now that's, if she wins the next election, that's going to be in 2020, which means she'll have 3 years left to end her term. So in that 3 years, she's got to be super successful. She has to be introducing lots of immigration policies and getting the economy, powerful and doing really well, and, saving the NHS and doing everything she can to make sure that the Brexit thing was a huge success. If she doesn't do that, chances are the party in power will change. Now, I actually don't really expect her to be able to do all of that in 3 years after we've left the EU, because I suspect that the deal is going to be quite threatening to the UK, and it may in fact be a no deal, or it may just be a not very good deal for the UK, but we'll wait and see on that. Another bad thing you can do is not to do like John Major did, is not to do, I'm sure he did a lot in this period here, but history doesn't remember it. So it's no surprise that history decided to change Prime Minister at that point, and Tony Blair seemed to do a lot more that history remembers at this point than John Major did at this point. So Theresa May is famous for kind of hiding herself and not being open and honest about her policies, and that could be another failure of hers if, as soon as we get the Brexit deal, she doesn't do like Tony Blair did. She needs to be doing something like that, and also having some success right towards the end of her term to win a Tory election the next term. Whether or not the UK sees the Brexit referendum in this election as a success or not has yet to be interpreted. I think the UK sees it as a failure for David Cameron's Conservatives. Certainly if he'd have been Prime Minister right now and carrying on into this election, he'd have probably lost because he failed in the last referendum. Theresa May is a different kind of brand, and she's decided to side with the Leave campaign brand. Even though she was a Remainer, she decided to side with the Leave campaign brand. That's probably going to be successful for her, but if she gets branded with the same kind of party and the same brush that David Cameron got branded with before he resigned, then it could make her lose the election, this election. But then you've got to think about the alternative, and for many people remember Labour as the Gordon Brown party and the Tony Blair party from this point onwards. As you can see, from this point onwards, the country was in a very, very bad state. But if the Labour Party can rebrand itself to what it was when Tony Blair took office, then it can make a comeback. Now, it's got a lot of catching up to do because of the local elections. You can tell it's going to be between Labour and the Conservatives. I suspect people no longer want a hung parliament, but again, we just got to wait and see. If you like this video, thank you for watching. Comment your opinion, subscribe, check out all my other videos. I do comedy and politics and everything. Thanks for watching.